Hi, my name is Marsha, I'm the coding blonde, and today we're talking about UX. I'm currently at GA and I'm about to interview Nick, who is a UX instructor at GA, and it's going to be amazing. Well, hi Nick.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, Nick, how are you?
Good.
Thank you for
Happy to be here.
Thank you very much for finding time to give me an interview.
Totally.
My audience would love to hear your expert opinion on UX. So what is UX for you? How would you...
So, user experience stands for UX, stands for user experience. The basic idea here is learning how to craft user experiences for people that are going to be meaningful and utilitarian, something that they're going to be able to use easily. I often tell people when they're asking me about what kind of courses I teach and things like that, that UX is kind of this blend where engineering meets art. So there's a component to it that's about how things look, making them look pretty and nice, but that's not the backbone of UX. A lot of pretty things are unusable. We talk a lot about like really attractive doors that you're not sure whether to push or pull. Norman door, maybe you've heard of that.
Yeah.
So that plus the engineering side, where we think about the data and the research that goes into figuring out who's going to be using our products, not just demographics, but also how interaction, states of the market, what people are looking for. So there's a lot of considerations that go to that, but the main idea is how do you craft an interaction with a digital object or a physical object for that matter that is meaningful, provides feedback, and is an easy thing for someone to use.
That's a great explanation.
Thank you.
And I've never heard the phrase that art meets engineering, and that's where UX happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, in the past iterations of these jobs, the same way that web development's changed a lot over the years, design has too. And, back in the print graphic design days, a lot of it was just about making things look really attractive. What can we do with typography? What can be experimental, get people's attention? Now that we're creating design products that are being used by people in a digital space, it's really changed and it's evolved a whole lot.
It's great to see that businesses are finally coming around to the actual
It's
users.
good. Yeah.
Finally, thank you.
Yeah. It's been a long road.
And how did you come to UX? What has your journey been like?
Yeah, so basically, long story short, I went to an art school. And I was not very good at high school, and I was not sure exactly what I was going to do with myself. I knew that I could draw. I know that I liked creating things. And so I went to an art school and quickly learned design as part of the programs there. I learned interactive media design, so they weren't sure exactly what to call it at the time because it was a blend of graphic design and web development. So I started learning a little bit of design. I learned the more design that I picked up, the more I wanted to make it move. I wanted to do things with it. And so I started learning some very basic CSS, HTML, web design tools so I could make my designs interactive. Then I started learning, if I could actually create a database, could have users, and I could have dynamic data that did things. So I leaned further into web development. So most of my career since then has been either going back and forth between UX jobs and development jobs, or blending the two together as sort of like a UX developer role where I'm doing a little bit of both. I would say just my general love from it comes from, as a kid, wanting to take things apart, doing a bad job of putting them back together, but over time learning how to actually assemble some of the things that I was trying to create.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you're fine. So this is what we call a bad user experience.
Yes,
you're trying to time and record something and your
Yes.
phone is popping up with notifications. These are the sort of problems that we're looking at, right? And those sort of annoyances is always what would get on my nerves. Little things like that. I was always interested about why certain mechanical things I interacted with did the things they did. I always wondered, why is it hard to use my VCR or my thermostat? And so pulling design problems apart and trying to make them work was sort of the engineering side of my brain, whereas loving art, wanting to get into typography and poster design was more the artistic side. And when I realized that we had this way of blending the two together, it was like a perfect match.
That's amazing. So can you walk me through the different stages of putting them together?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just briefly, what are they?
So basically, we have two main components: justifying your design decisions and then creating those designs. So basically, any good user researcher user experience designer is going to start with research as the first step. You have to gather information about who's using your product, your business analysis, basic user flows for what you want to do, and start to blend all that data into some sort of concept for how things are going to move on. I worked with a company for a while where basically they launched a website for Miracle-Gro, and one of their big asks was they wanted a store to buy like Miracle-Gro stuff through. And what they discovered through a lot of their research is that people didn't need another place to buy Miracle-Gro. They had stores and Home Depot and stuff. What they really needed was a way to inform them when to use those products. So what they ended up building was an app that allowed them to track what was going on with their yard and at a given season and say, oh, this is the time to water, this is the time to aerate. Also, here's a good fertilizer you can use. And so that flow is a lot better. It's through the research aspect that you get insights like that about what people actually want out of what they're making. So first up, research, validate everything. Then you're going to go into an iterative design process where basically you are designing first wireframes, just some basic layouts of what's going on inside of your app, how you want that to focus and what you want it to do, making that a little higher fidelity, justifying that with more research, more interviews, and then just kind of doing this big circle of going back. What didn't work? What do we need to improve? And that could last days, months, years in some of the projects I've worked on. It eventually leads to a point where you're designing very high fidelity mock-ups. But there's this whole field of graphic design, which is making things beautiful, and a lot of people assume that that's where it starts, but it's not. That's the end point. If I can point to a button and say that's really beautiful, but why is it there? What does it do? And you can't validate that, not just with your opinion, but with what users actually want, what we've collected as data for that, then you haven't done your job. So research is always going to be first. Structuring that, synthesizing it into something that leads you to some conclusion, some sort of this is what we got from that, and then turning those into designs. That's the basic flow of that process. Yeah,
it's true. You shouldn't be putting calls to actions into the design. It should be super intuitive, that the user just understands why this button is there.
Yeah.
They know what to do with it.
Exactly. As soon as you write the word click here, you've lost the battle. You shouldn't have to tell me what to do.
Fair enough.
It should be obvious.
Fair enough. That's such an amazing process to me. It's just like finding out what the user actually needs, and in your example, it was perfect. Just they wanted to do one thing, and then they realize that actually the user needs a completely different thing.
Yeah, and that's what we really try to, what I try to train people to do is not just what you think, not your assumptions, because that's how we end up with apps that don't do what we want. You have to dig in and see what people actually need.
So would you say that actually finding that out is the trickiest part of UX design?
All the parts are tricky. It really depends. So discovering that, doing that research aspect to know what people want, I would say that is one of the hardest parts for both the stakeholders, the people who are running those projects, and also for the designers themselves. UX can be an emotional process. Design can, because with development, there's a lot of creativity behind it, obviously, and a lot of problem solving. But at the end of the day, it works or it doesn't. When I've taught web development, those projects usually do great because server doesn't load. You failed. It's a lot easier. With UX, it can be, well, does that work? What evidence do you have that works? Can you prove that to me? Because honestly, when you're pitching things to non-technical people, trying to convince them that you've made the right decision, it's not enough to say, trust me, I'm a professional. You have to say, well, we A/B tested this, and your idea that you were currently going with had a bounce rate of 90%. And when we implemented this plan B, it dropped to 40%. And so we've seen huge improvements. So that's why my design is justified, and that's why what we need to do. Aside from that, trying to be creative while still sticking to patterns is really difficult. So we have things like the Apple HIG, which is Apple's sort of Bible for design standards. This is how you build things. It's a lot of flatness. They've introduced things like action sheets, but there's a lot of just sort of flat design, and they have a philosophy around that, which they think makes things more accessible. Google has gone a slightly different way with the material design, where there is depth and they want to simulate things being an actual physical material, right? We have these design conventions that we're trying to stick to, but at the same time, if we stick too hard to these, we end up with apps that are ubiquitous, they look the same, there's no real creativity or innovation. So it's finding those lines, getting your app looking exactly correct, but then figuring out where you can innovate and push on it a little bit. And a lot of times designers don't know when they have a hit and when they're doing something poorly. They need to understand, like, there could be a lot of back and forth, and people are going to disagree. Their ideas might get a lot of negative feedback, and they have to take that and run with it. So every step presents its own problems, but as long as you're dedicated to being humble and rehashing through all that, there's no end to the kind of creativity you can pull out of this job.
Yeah, there's just so much that you need to, especially when you do research and you're putting that all into wireframes. How do you normally approach this? How do you translate research into wireframes?
Absolutely. So let's say you did a bunch of user interviews and you determined, so one of my students, they just got done doing a Netflix sort of feature ad. And what I basically asked them to do in a brief was to add in a social function so you could co-watch a movie with someone and have some sort of chat functionality. And they started wireframing, and initially they realized that the Netflix catalog was so diverse. There's so many things you can do, and then there's so many questions of just like, well, how do you sync someone's audio and video playback to exactly where you are? Who has admin roles over this? How do we do this? And it was just this gigantic divergent nightmare of just, we don't know how to do this. And so they came up with this idea where they said, maybe we do this one time. We try it one time with like Stranger Things season 3. It is a one-night event. It launches at this time. It's one giant watch party. And we try that one time and see how it goes. And then we iterate from there. Can we do it one time, one event, one location? There's no syncing, there's no admin privileges. It's an open party. It's a giant, release party. And then use that data to pull that back into our next iteration. So a lot of this is taking the information that you got from users. What do people want to do? Do they want to watch with their friends? If so, are they people in another area of the world? Maybe you're in a long distance relationship with someone and you want to be able to have a movie night where you watch something together. Developing these personas of who are these users that might step through this and use this app. Then kind of creating what we call their user flow. If they were using this to watch with a long distance partner, what does their night look like? We might use something like a journey map where we track their emotions as they go through a specific plan. Like they are missing their partner, and so they say, I'd really like to watch this movie with you, send them a text message. How do we get into that flow and start grabbing onto that? Does it start with a text message? Does it start with opening the Netflix app? Does it start with making them download a new app? And then from there, you start to be able to figure out what screens of this may look like. From the moment you pick up your phone, how does it start? From there, we ask them basically just to start designing some very low-level, block-level wireframes. Sometimes this is just scratched on paper with like crayons. Sometimes it's on whiteboards. Sometimes it's on paper. But the idea of like, what does this page look like? The whole time they're doing this, you're going to need to be referring to design libraries. What are the patterns that we've established? What can we borrow from pre-existing places, and what do we need to innovate on? And then the more you go back through that, it's sort of like editing an essay you're writing or anything else. You're slowly removing, adding, refining, and then they get higher and higher fidelity as you go. Last step would be adding in branding and colors, because if it doesn't work as a plain black and white wireframe, it's not going to work as a full color app. You can't rely on visual design to save it. You have to justify those wireframes and move forward. So throughout that process, you're probably looking back again and trying to re-justify the decisions you've made. You can get lost sometimes and get really far into it and get excited. This feature, it seems so cool. I really want to make this. And then you look at the end product, you're like, we missed a step somewhere because this is unusable. Nobody wants this. So it's basically just submitting to that circle, surrendering your ego, and just allowing it to go again, and say, I messed it up. It's not good enough yet. We're going to go back to the beginning.
Yeah, that's such a complicated process. I actually did a UX course, an evening UX course before coming out to Denver, and I remember creating that user path through the different screens of my fictional app, And it was so difficult because there's so many different things that they could click, and it was just creating the user journey map was almost impossible to me as someone who's new to this. How do you normally approach it? Do you have sticky notes? Do you create one on Sketch, for example? Or what's your process normally to kind of think through that user flow before
you get out there? So I would say that first you want to have a well-defined feature. What is the thing you are creating? What's the purpose behind that? Who's going to be using it? Once you have that, you can start with a very basic user flow. And this can be an aspirational user flow. Ideally, I log into Netflix, I sign up for this watch party, I say I want to opt in, and when it's time for that watch party to begin, I get a notification. Push notification, something like that, text message that tells me it's beginning. I click that, I log in, I watch it. Now at this point, I'm just thinking through it, and I could literally just be drawing boxes that say, get text message, click on text message, open app. I don't need to be assigning, what graphic pops up? Because we're not there yet. We're just thinking what individually happens here. This is going to go hand in hand with a sitemap so that you know all the pages available. So if you're pushing this into an existing brand or even starting over, you need to say, okay, what is this shape like? What is the data coming from? This is where I really encourage people to talk to their development team. I know that the design and the development team can be siloed. It's sort of a contentious rivalry at times, but it really shouldn't be because you're working on the same team. It's two sides of the same coin. So I encourage people to, at this point, talk to the developers about what are your data models? Like, what are we looking at? Where are these people coming from? How are we storing their sessions? Is it by movie? Is it by person? What's the main thing that we have our data modeled around? So from there, you can start figuring out, this is the sitemap. This is the path someone's taking through it, right? And that's generally going to be your first step for developing those user flows, trying to connect those dots. From there, there's going to be a million other divergent paths that they could click the wrong thing, get confused, get stuck in some weird spiral. So you can work your way out from there, but the idea first is, what is that one user flow that's going to get them all the way through it? Does that help answer the question a little bit?
Yeah, that really does.
Cool.
Yeah, because I feel like a lot of people would probably try to jump straight into wireframing and be like, okay, so this button's going to be here, and so that's probably one of the biggest mistakes people who are new to UX just try to jump into, right?
People like to get ahead of themselves a little bit because they get excited about the fun stuff, which is the colors and the fonts and like
the buttons.
And they're gonna do this thing and we'll make it. It's gonna do weird things with your phone. That's always fun, and we call that the sizzle, right? But you don't have sizzle without steak or bacon, whatever meat metaphor you want there. You have to be able to cook something to get that flavor out of it.
Fair
so
enough.
There has to be some meat, and a lot of times those first few steps are a little dry, a little boring. You're planning out stuff that feels obvious, but we have a process where I show my students like an Amazon product page, and I ask them, what will these things do when you click them? And their initial thought is like, I shop on Amazon all the time, totally easy. But I'll point to parts and they'll be like, I don't know what that button is going to do. It says see more, and I'm like, they're like, oh, that's going to show more, and I'm like, how? Is it going to drop something down? Is it going to open a modal? And the fact is a lot of them haven't thought through this. As designers, we get carried away and we think, oh, we'll just see more and blow up image and then link over here. We start adding things, but we don't think about what does that do to the overall process? Does it add more dev work? So you really have to step and think through each individual piece. What does every little thing do? And that is an exhausting process.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
I can imagine, because there are just so many
things.
So another question that came up, because I did some research with my audience and they provided amazing questions.
Great.
One of them was, how do you design the same product for different users?
Wow. Yeah, and that is a great question. We're always trying to answer. So, first up is designing these personas and figuring out the types of people that might be using your service. So for instance, designing, one of our co-instructors that I work with, she designed the Domino's Pizza Tracker app, and some of the personas she had to think of was, you might have someone who is in a hurry and trying to get a pizza. Maybe they have a family at home and they're running late from work, so they need to order a pizza that gets to their house when they're showing up and picking up the kids. And that is a very different user need than literally one of her personas was called Drunk Homer Simpson. Someone who had a lot of beers, they decided they want a pizza, and they are very impatient because perhaps their perception of time is being skewed a little bit. And they also need the pizza tracker because they're hungry, and you don't want a drunk person calling Domino's multiple times asking them where their pizza is. So giving them a small bar that slowly fills up with, they have like holiday themes for it, or like weird little funny mini games you can play with it while you're waiting, is the perfect thing to sort of babysit someone while they're waiting for that food to come. So a lot of it comes into how do you provide a consistent user experience for everyone, but that has either divergent paths or different ways of satisfying those things. You're never going to make a app or a website that is perfect for every user. It just doesn't work that way. Obviously, we want to be aware of things like ADA recommendations, people who are using screen readers, color blindness, things like that. But as far as like personal preference, we're trying to figure out what is going to get the most acceptance from our tool out of a very wide audience, and that can be extremely difficult. I would say that looking at your most important use cases, most important personas, what are we really designing for here, and then seeing can that still work for other users, or do we need to either add, diverge, or remove in order to make it simpler. I was working with Aetna earlier this year as a UX consultant, trying to make their app that they have. And, it's not super fun to design an insurance app because it's claims and benefits and bills and stuff.
Of course.
And I think the team I was working with, there's a lot of desire for us, like, what if we did there's a deck of cards and there's like cool cards that you can sort through, or there's what if it was like there's these animations. And we had to keep reminding them, it's just, we're designing this. The people who are going to be using this app, first of all, you're not in a great mood if you open an insurance app. Nobody's doing that because they're excited, right? And second of all, the people that are more likely to be opening the insurance app are people with more detrimental health effects that could be affecting their ability to use that app. People who are elderly that have trouble using technology, people who have glaucoma and aren't able to see the screen as well. So we kind of have to consider, like, we want it to look nice, but it needs to be accessible to the people that are going to be the largest demographic. So maybe it's not a sexy product. Maybe it doesn't look really slick and beautiful and doesn't compete with like Apple's, latest rollouts, but it will be effective and it will be usable. And I think I'd rather see a boring app that allows everybody to use it the way that they need to than a really flashy app that impresses a few people but is unusable to most of your user base.
Yeah, and I can imagine frustrates them so much that they would even maybe consider switching their insurance company or something like that.
Absolutely, that's a huge plan in that.
So would you say that UX follows different trends and therefore affects consumer behavior according to those?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of trends we see emerge and die off. And there's a lot of people in the industry that either are very forward-thinking or are kind of pulling it back towards the standards. I think that happens in any industry. So, for instance, when I was going to college, we were taught nobody scrolls below the fold, which the fold is like where the viewport cuts off for your screen. It's taken from like newspaper terms when they literally, if anything was written before the fold, it wasn't on the front page, you couldn't see it without turning it over. And there was this idea that just like print, if you had to scroll, all that information was gone. So I remember meticulously measuring websites so that the most important information was crammed above the fold. And that was the pattern. Back in the 90s, it took so long to download a web page that we were just like, it needs to be all one page that is gigantic and you're just going to scroll forever. We saw that disappear in the 2000s when broadband got a little bit better, and then it was cool to have these giant drop-down menus where you could pick different things. Now we see that disappearing again because we have technologies like Angular and React that allow you to basically rewrite data inside of the page, re-render without having to reload the page. And so now we see a lot of websites like portfolio websites and brochure websites that it's just one page. And then when you say, oh, I want to see your menu or your pricing or something, it just pops up a new area, closes it down, or it's a different section. So those are trends that are happening, but the real UX problems have been solved a long time ago. They've been solved in analog products. And we have a tendency to forget that a lot of the issues we have with the tools we use, we've already figured out in some way. You have people like Jakob Nielsen who, he's very old guard. He doesn't believe that any links should not be blue and underlined, like that Craigslist blue. That's the most accessible. People know what it means, and when you don't have an underline under text, then you won't know necessarily it's a link. But obviously, if you've been to a website recently, that's not observed universally. Now we know that different colored text generally means a link, or maybe bold, or maybe it's italic. So we're playing with these little tweaks to see what we can move on, because it is this fight between pure usability and that data-driven side and visual design, because we want it to be interesting. Craigslist might be useful for finding used bikes or a place to live, but it's not, we don't hold it to a design standard. It's not pretty. So we want something better than Craigslist, but something as usable as Craigslist.
Yeah, it's fascinating how just the way we perceive things is changing. That's so true. I do remember all those clunky websites and stuff like that in the 90s. And
we've made some mistakes, yeah.
Seriously, and just thinking that web design and putting things on a page was basically putting things in a table and arranging them like that.
Table-based layouts,
Oh god, oh fun.
Yeah, so good. Which once again, we have a cyclical nature to this. We got rid of the table-based layouts. We went to CSS box model. Then we introduced Flexbox, and we have like the 12-column grid and Bootstrap. And then I don't know if you played around with CSS Grid. It's a new design spec for CSS. I believe it has almost full browser support at this point, and it's going to be the next cool thing. I started playing around with it, and I realized this is tables again. It's just tables. It's better tables, but it literally is, the structure is you're declaring boxes, declaring cells and rows. It's so much better, but at the same time, I'm just like, I can't believe we're back here again where we're doing table-based layouts. So it's really interesting to watch the sort of cyclical nature of design.
That is fascinating. Oh my god, I'm scared now.
Yeah.
I need to play
Honestly, it's
well.
really fun. It's a good tool, but once you kind of deconstruct it a little bit, you do realize there's a lot of table-based stuff borrowed from it. So.
Oh my god. I need to check it out now.
Yeah.
Now I'm just
really
like, I'm itching now.
Yeah, it's really good. Jen Simmons is kind of leading the front on really great CSS grid design. She has a whole labs page. She has a lot of really great demos, and her design is just incredible. The things she's doing with the responsive layouts, just like, it's so good.
Wow.
Yeah, so I highly recommend that.
Thank you. Check that out.
Yeah.
So what would you say is kind of a requirement for someone who wants to do UX? Are there any requirements? Is there personality traits, educational background, anything? What would you say?
Honestly, so I teach at General Assembly, and my philosophy when it comes to teachers is what I call the Ratatouille philosophy, which Remy reads the book where he has the quote by Gustavo that not everyone can be a great chef, but a good chef can come from everyone. I feel that way about designers, developers, the whole thing. If this is something you want to do, you can do it. We're living in a time where a lot of the tech industry is kind of controlled by gatekeepers. There's a definite aesthetic that if you're not a white 20-something dude in Silicon Valley with, the beard hat, glasses thing that I've got going on, if you don't look like this, you don't belong in the tech industry. And this idea that like certain people were not made for the tech industry, you have to be this thing, And I have friends who grew up like getting in trouble for reading JavaScript books under their beds at night with a flashlight, and her mom's like, shut off the light, go to bed, stop reading your JavaScript manuals. And those people definitely exist, but those aren't the only people that deserve to be in this industry. We've had all sorts of students come through here from all different backgrounds that are all amazing. Some of my best students have actually been competitive bodybuilders, which it's funny because people see like some gigantic like bodybuilder dude sitting in the class, and I'm like, where the hell did he come from? But the fact is like people who have trained their bodies know that like you start from nowhere, and the more effort you put into something, it hurts, and you're really bad at it at first. But the more you practice, the more you get out of it, and the more you'll see personal development. So those types of students have never given up on me. They just keep going no matter what. All I'm looking for when it comes to people who want to learn design is grit. Can you, when faced with problems, solve it and push through it? That's really what it comes down to. Design, development, it's just a matter of solving problems. If you can learn a separate language like Spanish, you can learn coding. If you can learn like basic color theory, like what we learned in kindergarten, if here's the color wheel, these are how you mix together, you can learn design. It's really just a matter of, do you want to do this? And when it gets difficult and you feel overwhelmed by a lot of new terms and new technology, can you just go through it? Can you just keep hacking at it until you get there? And so I'm very much against the idea that it takes a certain type to do this. It really doesn't.
I love that. Oh my God. Yes. Yes.
Good. Yeah.
And what would you say after somebody who discovered UX for themselves and, for example, did a course just like the one that you're teaching at GA?
Absolutely.
What are the potential career opportunities for them? Where could they take their career after that?
Oh, so many places. So one of the first things I do with my students, we have like an outcomes program where we help them kind of shape their career path after this. And basically it's just trying to narrow down like what they like doing. So for UX, there's the user research side, gathering data, talking to people, figuring out what's going on out there. Then there's, could be combined or could be a separate role to synthesize that. Put that either into digital charts or basically just drawing assumptions, and I guess I shouldn't say assumptions, drawing informational findings from that. There's a whole area of information architecture. So you've gotten the data, you know what people want, you know the general things this product you're working on does. So how's that sitemap gonna look? Where's that information gonna live? How do we segment this out? And that can overlap a lot with business logic and figuring out from a high level, even content writing, that's another weird little tangent you can take there. From there, there's a lot of people who focus on wireframes, just taking the sitemaps and the requests of the clients and start laying those out using design patterns, conventions, UI tools. And then there's the more visual design, which is going to be full-scale mockups, color. At this point, you're integrating tools like Photoshop, where you're doing really nice visual layouts, maybe with photographs. Sketch is a tool that people use a lot in the industry. It's a personal favorite of mine. So actually like making these high-res mockups and making deliverables that can be passed off to a developer. From there, you can go two different ways. I like to think of the entire tech app creation world as a sort of circle where they all connect. So the right side of the circle for UX is going to lead into development. So if you can do design, but then you start picking up coding skills, you could become like a UX developer. I did this for a few years where basically I was working with a print agency in San Francisco and a web firm in Denver, and basically translating between the two. They would give me these rough ideas, and sometimes it was like they were handing me branded colors and stuff like this, but other times they're just like, we want this to whoosh, like a whoosh, and it's fast, but then it's slow at the end. And I'm like, okay, I can work with that. And then I would write the code for that, and we would kind of go back and forth, and I'd say, okay, send them like a little code sample, be like, is this the kind of whoosh you're looking for? And they're like, a little bit, and then kind of improvising on some of those designs, where they're saying, okay, we have this ancillary page, it has to show a timeline, do you have some ideas of how that would look, what can you build? And I would make something, we'd go back and forth. So it was this really fun hybrid design development role. On the other end of the spectrum, you can go so hard into data and the research side that you're essentially becoming a data scientist. If you start doing the development in hard mode and going into Python, pandas, stuff like that, you can be someone who is actually conducting data and then running algorithms against it to find trends and different points of information you want to focus on. And then taking that and putting that into your design specs and saying, this is what we're finding, our bounce rate here is this much, our click rates here, our unique hits are looking like this is what people are reading and clicking on, let's go from there, right? So the doors are wide open. As far as and that's kind of like entry level stuff of where you can kind of start. You can work your way up to being like a creative director or like a lead researcher. There's so many ways to kind of go up that. So, I would say go to a job board, Glassdoor, something like that, and just see like what people are hiring for. Call people that work at places you like. We have a student right now where she was asking me, she's like, I'm going to these networking events. I'm meeting people. I'm good at it. I like talking to people. What's the next step? And I just ask them if they want to get coffee. And then she ended up asking a dude who works at Google to get coffee with her. And then he invited her in to see the UX team and got to meet some of these people. People are excited to help you out, So just by asking around, saying hey, this seems interesting to me. Can you talk to me for 5 minutes? A lot of people are like, yeah, I'd love to talk to you.
It's fascinating how many opportunities there are in this
there really
world.
Are. Absolutely. And I mean, I think that design is one of those things that we're not going to see a fade in demand for, because it's the creative part of it. It's the solving those problems. And we're not at a point where any sort of machine or automation can solve problems like that.
And has enough emotional intelligence to
Yeah.
understand what users actually need.
Yeah, and to have insights to kind of skew off that project. So yeah, there's a huge demand for it, and there's so many things you can do with it.
Yeah.
And it's very fun. I've always enjoyed working as a UX designer.
I can imagine. Would you say that one needs a portfolio to apply for a job? And what would your recommendations be around that if
Yeah,
that's the case?
you definitely need a portfolio of some kind. And when I say portfolio, what I mean is a collection of work that demonstrates your ability to solve design problems. This could be a PDF that you're sending around. Most commonly, what I would recommend for people is to have a website. That's going to consist of the website itself with your contact info, a little bit about what you've done, what you do. And along with that, your work, probably in the form of case studies. Case studies are just stories about the design problems you solved. Someone had this issue, this is what I did to solve it, here's the results. Right? So you want a case study for all the different pieces of work you've done. A website is going to be the biggest selling point. Tools like Squarespace now have made it so easy to get a design portfolio. So I have a lot of students who come in and they have tangential experience in different things. We had a student last cohort who had industrial design experience, and she had won some like New York Design Awards for these sustainable napkin holders she had made. And I was like, by all means, put that in your portfolio. You solved a design problem and an ecological problem with these sustainable napkin holders. So anything that you can leverage, you can put in there. But basically just proving that you can solve those problems is going to be the first step. There is sort of an argument in the industry of, do designers need portfolios? I feel like yes, always. Maybe when you're senior level, you're just so popular, word of mouth does it for you. But if you're trying to break into the industry, a good demonstratable portfolio is essential.
And how would you recommend people to start developing it? For example, from scratch, somebody doesn't have a portfolio. How should they go about finding those projects that they can actually work on to solve those problems, to then showcase that they've done that?
Well, everyone needs design, whether they know it or not. A lot of people do. So I make a lot of my students do client projects. And to do that, I basically say, reach out to your network first. Find, your aunt that makes jewelry in her basement, right? And is selling it on Etsy. Or find your friends that are starting a coffee shop or a brewery or something. And then say, hey, can I help? You don't have to promise them specific deliverables. You don't have to say, I'm going to do your entire website and solve every problem you've ever had. But you can say, I'd like to work on helping making your website better, either through research or through some visual design, whatever you want to do. Find people who are probably not going to pay you anything, but would very much like your help. Nonprofits are a great place to start if you have a cause you're motivated about. Find someone who needs your help and give that to them. So if you were really truly just starting out in your industry, you can find people who need work. And also, it's totally fine to do things on spec. Say you really hate Instagram's new redesign. Do your own version and put it up there, and just be very forthright in saying that I did not do this for Instagram, they didn't ask me to do it, but this is what I made for them, this is what I think their website could be, right? And that should be enough to start to boost you up a little bit there. Share it on Dribbble, put it out there, get feedback from people. And once you have 3 or 4 good projects, you've got yourself a portfolio, and you can start looking for work.
That's awesome. I feel like UX is not only on websites, on apps, right? It can be here. This table, for example, might need better user experience, not stuff. Maybe it's not ergonomical. Actually, I was reading about this. User experience, the science of user experience has come from ergonomics.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is amazing. And it's true. Like, it has, that is how we experience the world. And
Yeah. And there's a lot of good design analogs. One of the first things that I do is make my students walk through this building actually and report back on some of the usability issues they find here. So for instance, the microwaves, a little difficult. You have to press a button that says microwave like 3 or 4 times before you get to the function that causes it to microwave food. There's a lot of doors here that are glass but do not have any frosting on them. And if you are in a hurry, you might walk into it. So there's a lot of little things you'll notice day to day as you start studying these things where just bad design is applied. And that's a lot easier sometimes to explain analog examples of this than digital ones, but there's plenty of digital ones you can talk about as well. So
Definitely.
Yeah.
And what would your recommendations be for people who are just starting out in UX? Where should they start?
Well, General Assembly is a great option here. Obviously, I really like General Assembly's approach. We do full-time courses and part-time courses for UX. Outside of that, training is always good. I would say that the industry in general is not focused on education so much as they're focused on skills. Can you do the thing? So there's tons of free online resources. You won't need a college degree necessarily. Some like bigger Fortune 500 companies, or if you are wanting to go into governmental work, yeah, you'll need some. You might need the transcripts and things like that. But in general, if you can prove that you can do the work, people are happy to hire you. So training programs, boot camps like what I teach at, those are a great option. 3 to 6 months is really enough to get you into a point where you're able to start producing work. Then there are, of course, like 4-year college degrees. You can go and do this and get like some gen eds out of that as well. A lot of people I've worked with are self-taught. They just decided they wanted to do this. They sat down, they studied, they practiced, and they got there. Some people struggle with the motivation factor there. Can they, when it gets hard, can they continue to push themselves through? In which case, if you find yourself in that scenario, I would say look into some sort of training program, whether it's part-time, weekend, something like that. Or find a mentor, someone who can teach you. But basically just practice. I tell my students, when I was going to art school, I used to be friends with a lot of film students. They would invite me over like, oh, have you seen The Godfather? We should watch The Godfather. And I'm like, no, I've never seen that. Let's go watch it. And it would take us 8 hours to watch The Godfather because every scene they would pause it and they deconstruct the lighting and they talk about the blocking. You're like, okay, you see what he said? Okay, now watch this next scene. Then I realized I was watching the movie, they were studying it. They were tearing it apart, deconstructing it, figuring out why every decision was made. So I tell my students, download apps, go to websites, and don't just use them, deconstruct them, think about them. Why is this button here? Why did that interaction just feel weird? Have you seen this on other websites? That's the best way to start learning about what UX is and how to experience it. And then starting to pick up some software like Sketch is really becoming the industry standard, and starting to try to replicate those designs. You can start by tracing stuff that you see online so you get a use of the tools, but then start creating your own work from there. I have my students use Daily UI, which basically just every day sends you an email of a thing to design. It would be like a pricing table or a product customization tool or something like that. And then every night they just practice and make a new thing, and all that practice adds up to a lot of skill.
That's amazing. That's a very, very cool tool.
Yeah.
I need to check it out.
Yeah,
sure.
It's very helpful just to keep your skills sharp.
And just like to have something to design, because sometimes the lack of motivation comes from not knowing what to practice, not having a project, and that's the best way.
And people get hung up on that. You don't have to practice anything in particular, just practice the tools. Just walk through the thinking. Honestly, a random prompt is the best sometimes.
Thank you so much.
So welcome.
This has been amazing and just like a waterfall of amazing information.
Good. Okay, I'm glad. Hopefully I had too much water, but
not water as in like useful, nutritious, liquid
Good.
with
good,
electrolytes.
Yes.
And all that good stuff.
Perfect. I'm so glad I could help that.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
Cool.
Bye.
All right, thanks.
I hope you've enjoyed that, and oh my god, I've learned so much from that interview. It was amazing, and I tried to integrate your questions from Instagram as much as I could. I hope that you found your answers, and please let me know what you think about this video in the comments. Also, you can find all the links to Nick's work on social media below in the description, so if you want to learn more about him or follow him, that's where you can find it. Thank you.